in the window. The living form collected itself, and then jumped wildly through that hole into the gardens. Denry ran. The moment had not struck him as a moment propitious for explanation. In a flash he had seen the ridiculousness of endeavouring to convince a stout lady in black that he was a gentleman paying a call on the Countess. He simply scrambled to his legs and ran. He ran aimlessly in the darkness, and sprawled over a hedge after crossing various flower beds. Then he saw the sheen of the moon on Sneyd Lake, and he could take his bearings. In winter all the Five Towns skate on Sneyd Lake, if the ice will bear, and the geography of it was quite familiar to Denry. He skirted its east bank, plunged into Great Shendon Wood, and emerged near Great Shendon Station, on the line from Stafford to Knype. He inquired for the next train in the tones of innocency, and in half an hour was passing through Sneyd Station itself. In another 50 minutes he was at home. The clock showed 10:15. His mother's cottage seemed amazingly small. He said that he had been detained in Hanbridge on business, that he had had neither tea nor supper, and that he was hungry. Next morning he could scarcely be sure that his visit to Sneyd Hall was not a dream. In any event, it had been a complete failure. 5. It was on this untriumphant morning that one of the tenants under his control, calling at the cottage to pay some rent overdue, asked him when the Universal Thrift Club was going to commence its operations. He had talked of the enterprise to all his tenants, for it was precisely with his tenants that he hoped to make a beginning. He had there a clientèle ready to hand, and as he was intimately acquainted with the circumstances of each, he could judge between those who would be reliable and those to whom he would be obliged to refuse membership. The tenants, conclaving together of an evening on doorsteps, had come to the conclusion that the Universal Thrift Club was the very contrivance which they had lacked for years. They saw in it a cure for all their economic ills and the gate to paradise. The dame who put the question to him on the morning after his defeat wanted to be the possessor of carpets, a new teapot, a silver brooch, and a cookery book, and she was evidently depending upon Denry. On consideration, he saw no reason why the Universal Thrift Club should not be allowed to start itself by the impetus of its own intrinsic excellence. The dame was inscribed for 3 shares, paid 18p entrance fee, undertook to pay 3 shillings a week, and received a document entitling her to spend £3 18s in 65 shops as soon as she had paid £1 19s to Denry. It was a marvellous scheme. The rumour of it spread. Before dinner Denry had visits from other aspirants to membership, and he had posted a cheque to Bostocks, but more from ostentation than necessity, for no member could possibly go into Bostocks with his coupons until at least 2 months had elapsed. But immediately after dinner, when the posters of the early edition of the Signal waved in the streets, he had material for other thought. He saw a poster as he was walking across to his office. The awful legend ran: "Astounding attempted burglary at Sneyd Hall." In buying the paper he was afflicted with a kind of ague, and the description of events at Sneyd Hall was enough to give ague to a negro. The account had been taken from the lips of Mrs. Gater, housekeeper at Sneyd Hall. She had related to a reporter how, upon going into the state suite before retiring for the night, she had surprised a burglar of Herculean physique and titanic proportions. Fortunately she knew her duty and did not blench. The burglar had threatened her with a revolver, and then, finding such bluff futile, had deliberately jumped through a large plate glass window and vanished. Mrs. Gater could not conceive how the fellow had effected an entrance. According to the reporter, Mrs. Gater said "effected an entrance," not "got in." And here it may be mentioned that in the columns of the Signal, burglars never get into a residence. Without exception, they invariably effect an entrance. Mrs. Gater explained further how the plans of the burglar must have been laid with the most diabolic skill, how he must have studied the daily life of the Hall patiently for weeks, if not months, how he must have known the habits and plans of every soul in the place, and the exact instant at which the Countess had arranged to drive to Stafford to catch the London express. It appeared that, save for 4 maidservants, a page, 2 dogs, 3 gardeners, and the kitchen clerk, Mrs. Gater was alone in the Hall. During the late afternoon and early evening, They had all been to assist at a rat catching in the stables, and the burglar must have been aware of this. It passed Mrs. Gater's comprehension how the criminal had got clear away out of the gardens and park, for to set up a hue and cry had been with her the work of a moment. She could not be sure whether he had taken any valuable property, but the inventory was being checked, though surely for her an inventory was scarcely necessary, as she had been housekeeper at Sneyd Hall for 26 years, and might be said to know the entire contents of the mansion by heart. The police were at work. They had studied footprints and débris. There was talk of obtaining detectives from London. Up to the time of going to press, no clue had been discovered, but Mrs. Gater was confident that a clue would be discovered, and of her ability to recognise the burglar when he should be caught. His features, as seen in the moonlight, were imprinted on her mind for ever. He was a young man, well dressed. The Earl had telegraphed, offering a reward of £20 for the fellow's capture. A warrant was out. So it ran on. Denry saw clearly all the errors of tact which he had committed on the previous day. He ought not to have entered uninvited, but having entered, he ought to have held firm in quiet dignity until the housekeeper came, and then he ought to have gone into full details with the housekeeper, producing his credentials and showing her unmistakably that he was offended by the experience which somebody's gross carelessness had forced upon him. Instead of all that, he had behaved with simple stupidity, and the result was that a price was upon his head. Far from acquiring moral impressiveness and influential aid by his journey to Sneyd Hall, he had utterly ruined himself as a founder of a universal thrift club. You cannot conduct a thrift club from prison, and a sentence of 10 years does not inspire confidence in the ignorant mob. He trembled at the thought of what would happen when the police learnt from the Countess that a man with a card, on which was the name of Machin, had called at Sneyd just before her departure. However, the police never did learn this from the Countess, who had gone to Rome for the autumn. It appeared that her maid had merely said to the Countess that a man had called, and also that the maid had lost the card. Careful research showed that the burglar had been disturbed before he had opportunity to burgle, and the affair, after raising a terrific bother in the district, died down. Then it was that an article appeared in the Signal, signed by Denry, and giving a full picturesque description of the state apartments at Sneyd Hall. He had formed a habit of occasional contributions to the Signal. This article began: "The recent sensational burglary at Sneyd Hall has drawn attention to the magnificent state apartments of that unique mansion. As very few but the personal friends of the family are allowed a glimpse of these historic rooms, they being of course quite closed to the public, we have thought that some account of them might interest the readers of the Signal. On the occasion of our last visit," etc. He left out nothing of their splendour. The article was quoted as far as Birmingham in the Midlands press. People recalled Denry's famous waltz with the Countess at the memorable dance in Bursley Town Hall, and they were bound to assume that the relations thus begun had been more or less maintained. They were struck by Denry's amazing discreet self-denial in never boasting of them. Denry rose in the market of popular esteem. Talking of Denry, people talked of the Universal Thrift Club, which went quietly ahead, and they admitted that Denry was of the stuff which succeeds, and deserves to succeed. But only Denry himself could appreciate fully how great Denry was, to have snatched such a wondrous victory out of such a humiliating defeat. His chin slowly disappeared from view under a quite presentable beard. But whether the beard was encouraged out of respect for his mother's sage advice, or with the object of putting the housekeeper of Sneyd Hall off the scent, if she should chance to meet Denry, who shall say? End of Chapter 6.